The name Floriano Romani was a death sentence for anyone who dared cross his threshold uninvited. But when the city's most calculated crime boss stood in his own kitchen at 3 a.m., he didn't find a rival assassin, he found a wide-eyed girl with light brown hair sitting on his polished floor, clutching a discarded snack bag as if it were gold. The startled look she gave him didn't trigger his instinct to kill, it triggered a conscience he had buried decades ago. In the underworld, Floriano Romani was known for cold-blooded efficiency. He was a man who viewed the world as a ledger of debts and assets, where every person owed him something and mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mansion was a silent fortress, a place where his word was law and his shadow alone could terrify the most hardened criminals. But the silence of the Romani estate was broken one night by the crinkle of plastic in the moonlit kitchen. Expecting a threat, Floriano stepped into the doorway to find Kath, the young daughter of his quietest maid, Elizabeth. She wasn't there to steal secrets or jewelry, she was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood, eating scraps in the dark because her mother was drowning in a debt that left no room for food. When the girl looked up, expecting the monster of the house to strike, she didn't see a killer. She saw the man who was about to dismantle the very system of fear he had built. What Floriano did for that little girl and her mother that night would do more than just pay off a debt, it would rewrite the Romani legacy forever. The silence of the Romani estate was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that usually brought Floriano a sense of total control. He moved through the dimly lit hallway with the silent, predatory grace of a man who owned the shadows. His navy suit was still crisp despite the late hour, his mind already tallying the accounts of the day. Debts collected, rivals silenced, power reinforced. He had reached the kitchen doorway, intending only to pour a glass of water before retiring, when a sound fractured the stillness. It was a soft, rhythmic crinkle. To anyone else, it might have been the house settling or a stray breeze, but to Floriano, it was an anomaly. His hand moved by instinct, the muscles in his shoulder tensing as he prepared to reach for the concealed holster at his hip. In his world, an uninvited sound at 3:00 a.m. was a threat to be eliminated. He stepped into the frame of the doorway, his silhouette casting a long, intimidating shadow across the polished marble. But the gun stayed holstered. Bathed in the warm, low-hanging amber light of the pantry alcove was a sight that defied his cold logic. A young girl, no older than 8, sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. Her light brown hair was a mess of tangles, spilling over the shoulders of a simple, faded cotton dress that had clearly seen better days. Between her small, trembling hands was an open snack bag, the source of the crinkling sound. As the heavy weight of Floriano's presence hit her, the girl froze. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply looked up, her eyes wide and glassy with a terror so pure it felt like a physical blow to Floriano's chest. In that startling expression, he saw a reflection of a life he had forgotten, a life of wanting, of hiding, of being small in a world that felt too big and too cruel. Floriano stayed rooted to the spot. His name could empty boardrooms and make hardened soldiers tremble, yet he found himself momentarily paralyzed by the vulnerability of the child on his floor. She clutched the bag of scraps to her chest as if it were a shield, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound in the cavernous kitchen. "I'm sorry. I was so hungry." The monster of the Romani Empire, the man who had spent 30 years training himself to feel nothing, felt a sudden, sharp ache in his throat. He looked at the girl, Kath, and then at the discarded packaging around her. The lethal efficiency that usually guided his every move evaporated, replaced by a confusing, heavy sense of recognition. He didn't see an intruder. He saw an innocent caught in the gears of a machine he had helped build. For the first time in a long time, Floriano Romani didn't reach for his weapon, he simply watched, the iron walls around his heart developing a single, jagged crack. Floriano watched in silence as the child, trembling under the weight of his gaze, scurried back toward the service quarters at his quiet command. He didn't follow her. Instead, he remained in the kitchen, the taste of the night's cold reality lingering in the air more sharply than the scent of the expensive espresso he usually favored. He was a man who noticed everything, the caliber of a weapon, the slight hesitation in a trader's voice, yet he realized with a stinging clarity that he had failed to see what was happening under his own roof. The next morning, Floriano positioned himself in the shadow of the library balcony, overlooking the grand foyer. He wasn't watching for security breaches, he was watching Elizabeth K. Mull. She arrived at dawn, her movements as rhythmic and silent as a ghost's. To any other observer, she looked the part of the perfect employee, efficient, head down, invisible. But Floriano, now tuned to a different frequency, saw the truth. He watched the way she gripped the banister not for stability, but to haul her weary frame up the stairs. He saw the slight tremor in her hands as she polished the silver, and the way her skin seemed stretched too thin over her cheekbones, grayed by a fatigue that sleep could no longer cure. When the staff sat for their mid-morning break, Floriano observed from the kitchen's secondary monitor. A generous spread was provided for the workers, fresh bread, meats, and fruit. The other maids laughed and ate heartily, but Elizabeth merely tucked a small roll into her apron pocket and sipped a glass of water. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her expression one of hollowed-out determination. She wasn't avoiding the food out of a lack of appetite, she was saving every scrap of herself, and every cent of her meager existence, for the girl he had found on the floor. It was a slow-motion tragedy unfolding in the heart of his empire. Elizabeth wasn't just tired. She was fading. She was a woman who had turned her own body into a sacrifice, skipping meals until her ribs became a cage for a heart that only beat for her daughter. Floriano felt a cold, sharp anger rising within him, not at her, but at the invisible debt that demanded such a cruel price. He realized then that her silence wasn't a sign of contentment, but the quiet of a person who had no breath left to scream. She was working herself into an early grave to pay back men who traded in misery, and Floriano, the master of this house, had been the one providing the sanctuary that had become her prison. As he watched her nearly stumble while carrying a heavy tray of linens, the ledger in his mind shifted. The woman who cleaned his floors was carrying a weight heavier than any of his soldiers, and for the first time in 30 years, the boss of the Romani family decided that some debts were meant to be burned. The following afternoon, Floriano retreated to the cold, mahogany-scented sanctuary of his private study. He did not call for his lieutenants or his advisors. Instead, he pulled up the digital archives that contained the life stories of everyone under his employ. The background checks, the references, and the financial footprints that usually served only to ensure absolute loyalty. Until now, Elizabeth K. Mull had been nothing more than a series of green checkmarks indicating a clean record and a quiet life. As he began to dig deeper into the trail of her bank statements and credit history, the pristine image of the perfect maid began to bleed into something far more sinister. He found the source of the rot hidden beneath layers of automated payments and predatory interest rates. It was a debt not of her making, a massive medical liability and a high-interest private loan inherited from a deceased relative. To the legal world, it was a tragedy, to the men who owned that debt, it was a ledger of blood. Floriano leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his dark, unblinking eyes. He tracked the payments. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, nearly 80% of Elizabeth's salary was siphoned off within minutes of being deposited. The recipients were not banks or legitimate institutions, but shell companies linked to a local collection outfit known for their extra-legal methods. They weren't just taking her money, they were harvesting her life. He realized with a growing, icy fury that Elizabeth wasn't just working for him. She was working to survive the predators who followed her in the shadows. She skipped the meals in his kitchen because every calorie had a price she couldn't afford. She worked the double shifts until her hands bled because the interest was designed to be unpayable, a mountain that grew faster than she could climb. The ledger revealed the true horror of her situation. At the current rate, she would be paying these men until long after her daughter, Kath, was grown, and even then, the principal would barely be touched. It was a death sentence written in ink. Floriano's jaw tightened as he looked at the names of the men on the other side of that ledger. They were small-time vultures compared to the Romani Empire, yet they were the ones slowly killing the woman who kept his home. For 30 years, Floriano had respected the rules of the debt. The idea that what a person owed was their own burden to carry. But as he looked at the final balance, a number that represented the cost of a mother's life and a child's future, he felt the old rules crumbling. He closed the laptop with a sharp, final click that echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. The men holding Elizabeth's ledger thought they were collecting from a defenseless maid. They had no idea that their debt had just been acquired by a man who didn't deal in installments. He dealt in absolute resolutions. The following morning, the atmosphere in Floriano's private study was thick with the scent of old paper and the cold, sharp edge of impending violence. His two most trusted lieutenants, men who had cleared paths for the Romani Empire with ruthless precision, stood at attention before his desk. They had seen the boss's dark mood since the previous night and had already reached their own conclusions. In their world, when a high-profile asset like the Romani mansion was compromised by a breach of secrecy, even by a maid and her child, there was only one protocol. The woman, Elizabeth, the elder lieutenant began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The car is ready. We can have her and the girl removed by noon. No trace, no loose ends. We'll make it look like they simply moved on. Floriano didn't look up from the leather-bound ledger on his desk. He let the silence stretch until it became a suffocating weight in the room. The sunlight through the tall windows caught the navy sheen of his suit, but his eyes remained in the shadows. To his men, this was the quiet before the execution. They expected the order to clean the house, to erase the vulnerability he had discovered in his kitchen. "You've misunderstood the objective," Floriano said finally, his voice like sliding silk. He stood slowly, rounding the desk with a predatory grace that made even his seasoned soldiers stiffen. "We aren't removing the maid. Elizabeth K. Mull is the most loyal soldier in this house, and she has been fighting a war alone while we slept." He tossed a folder onto the table. It slid across the wood, stopping inches from the lieutenant's hand. Inside were the names, addresses, and shell companies of the predatory lenders he had unearthed the night before. "These men," Floriano continued, his gaze turning to ice. "They have been siphoning the life out of one of my people. They have been reaching into my home and taking the food out of a child's mouth to line their pockets. They believe they are the apex predators because they hunt the defenseless." The lieutenants traded a confused, wary glance. This wasn't a hit on a rival family or a government informant. This was something personal, something that defied the cold logic of the business. "I want a different kind of hit," Floriano commanded, leaning in until he was inches from their faces. "I don't want them dead. Not yet. I want their accounts frozen. I want their associates terrified. And I want the men who signed these collection notices brought to my warehouse tonight. They think they own a debt. By the time the sun goes down, they will realize they owe me everything." As the men nodded and hurried out to execute the new orders, Floriano turned back to the window. He watched Elizabeth in the garden below, her small, frail frame bent over the rose bushes, unaware that the shadow protecting her had just grown teeth. For the first time in his life, Floriano Romani wasn't sending his men to take a life, he was sending them to reclaim one. The hunt had begun, but for once, the boss wasn't looking for a profit, he was looking for justice. The following night, the mansion was settled into its usual graveyard silence, but the air in the kitchen felt different. No longer a cold, sterile gallery of marble and copper, but a stage for a quiet rebellion. Floriano did not enter with the heavy tread of a master, he arrived with the soft, deliberate patience of a man seeking an audience. He found Kath exactly where he had first seen her, tucked into the shadows of the pantry alcove. This time, however, she didn't flinch when the light caught his navy suit. She simply watched him, her light brown hair messy and her eyes wide with a cautious, burgeoning curiosity. Instead of standing over her, Floriano did something that would have paralyzed his lieutenants with shock. He lowered himself to the hardwood floor, his expensive trousers creasing as he sat cross-legged opposite her. Between them, he placed a silver tray, but it didn't hold the discarded scraps of a snack bag. It held 2 plates of warm, buttery toasted brioche, slices of aged prosciutto, and a bowl of fresh, glistening berries. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the industrial refrigerator. Floriano picked up a piece of fruit and ate it slowly, showing her it was safe. "The kitchen staff tells me this is the best in the city," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that lacked its usual edge of steel. "It's a waste to let it sit in the kitchen alone." Kath hesitated, her small hand hovering over the plate before she took a tentative bite. The warmth of the food seemed to thaw the last of her defenses. As she ate, the silence transformed from a barrier into a bridge. Floriano didn't press her for information about debts or her mother's exhaustion. Instead, he asked her what she saw when she looked out the small, high window of her basement room. The words poured out of her then, a fragile, staccato rhythm of a child's hidden heart. She didn't dream of toys or candy, she dreamt of a world where her mother didn't have the gray look on her face. She spoke of wanting to learn about the stars, because the stars were the only things that looked the same from the basement as they did from the grand balcony. She told him she wanted to be a doctor, so she could fix the tired in people's eyes. Floriano listened with an intensity he usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. He saw the flicker of a brilliant, untapped mind behind her innocent fearful gaze, a soul that hadn't been crushed by poverty, only hidden by it. Sitting on the floor, sharing a meal of real substance, he realized that he wasn't just hearing a child's dreams, he was seeing the person she could become if the world would just get out of her way. "You like the stars?" Floriano asked softly, looking at the girl who had once expected a bullet but was now reaching for a second piece of brioche. Kath nodded, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her startled expression. "Then we should make sure you can see them clearly," he promised. As the midnight hour passed, the ruthless crime boss and the maid's daughter sat in the golden glow of the pantry light, 2 unlikely allies. Floriano felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He had spent his life building a fortress to keep the world out, but in the simple act of sharing a snack on a kitchen floor, he realized he had finally let something meaningful in. The monster was gone, in his place was a guardian, and he knew that by dawn, the stars she loved would be the only limit to what he would do for her. The warehouse on the edge of the industrial district was a cathedral of cold concrete and rusting iron, a place where the city's light rarely reached. Inside, the air tasted of salt and old machinery. Floriano Romani stood in the center of the vast floor, his navy suit sharp against the grime, looking every bit the aristocrat of the underworld. Before him, 2 men sat bound to heavy wooden chairs. They were the architects of Elizabeth's misery, small-time predators who dressed in cheap leather and smelled of stale cigarettes, men who mistook cruelty for power. When they saw Floriano, the bravado they had used to intimidate a defenseless maid evaporated, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. They knew the Romani name. They knew that in this city, Floriano was the gravity that held everything together. "Mr. Romani, there's been a mistake," the taller one stammered, his voice cracking. "We didn't know the woman worked for you. We were just collecting what was owed. It's business. Just business." Floriano didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, his handmade shoes clicking rhythmically on the concrete. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto a small table between them. It landed with a heavy, hollow thud. "In that envelope is the full balance of the debt you claim Elizabeth K. Mull owes you," Floriano said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. "Every cent of the principal, every predatory point of interest, and a generous bonus for your trouble. The men blinked, confused. They had expected a beating, perhaps worse. They hadn't expected to be paid. A flicker of greed returned to their eyes as they looked at the envelope. But, Floriano continued, his eyes darkening until they were as black as the shadows behind him, there is a second part to this transaction. You see, I have also calculated a debt. The debt you owe for entering my home. The debt you owe for the meals that child missed. The debt for every hour of sleep that woman lost because she was terrified of your footsteps. He leaned in close, his shadow swallowing them both. I am paying her debt in cash. You will pay yours in silence. From this moment on, Elizabeth and her daughter do not exist to you. If I hear her name whispered in your offices, or if a single one of your collectors even walks on the same side of the street as her, I won't send an envelope next time. I will send my lieutenants to collect the interest you owe me. And I assure you, I am much less patient than a maid. He signaled to his men, who stepped forward with a heavy, industrial shredder. Floriano picked up the original loan documents, the ledger of blood he had seized from their office earlier that night. He fed the papers into the machine. The sound was a harsh, mechanical scream, echoing through the warehouse as the debt was reduced to gray confetti. The debt is paid, Floriano said, turning his back on them as his men moved to cut their restraints and escort them to the city limits with a permanent warning. But the memory of this night should stay with you. You hunt the weak because you think the strong aren't looking. Consider this your final lesson, I am always looking. He walked out into the cool night air, the weight of the ledger finally lifted. He hadn't just settled an account, he had erased a ghost. As he signaled for his car, Floriano felt the first real sense of peace he had known in years. The predators were gone, and for the first time, the halls of his mansion would be filled with a silence that wasn't born of fear, but of freedom. The following morning, the atmosphere within the mansion shifted as if the house itself had taken a long, overdue breath. Floriano stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hands clasped behind his back, watching as Elizabeth finished her morning rounds. She looked more fragile than ever, her skin sallow under the harsh morning light, her movements dictated by a weary muscle memory. She expected to be ignored, as she had been for years, but today, the master of the house did not walk past her. Elizabeth, Floriano said, his voice resonant and clear. Leave the linens. There is somewhere you and your daughter need to be. Confusion and a flicker of the old, familiar fear crossed her face, but she followed him in silence, her hand instinctively finding Kath's as the girl emerged from the shadows of the hallway. Floriano led them away from the service stairs, past the heavy mahogany doors of the executive wing, and toward the south gallery, a place where the sun flooded through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the marble in shades of gold. He stopped before a set of double doors that had remained locked for a decade. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed them open. The room was a sanctuary of light and warmth. Gone were the damp, windowless walls of the basement quarters. In their place was a sprawling suite designed with a quiet, understated elegance. There were plush cream carpets, a private library filled with books on the stars and science, and two bedroom chambers draped in the finest silks. But the centerpiece was the view, a massive terrace that overlooked the sprawling gardens and the city skyline beyond. This is your home now, Floriano said, turning to look at them. No more hiding in the shadows. No more basement air. Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at the space. For a woman who had spent her life making herself small to avoid notice, the sheer scale of the generosity was overwhelming. She looked at the polished furniture, the fresh flowers on the vanity, and the absence of the gray look in the room's vibrant energy. She looked at Floriano, her eyes filling with tears that weren't born of terror, but of a crushing, beautiful relief. Kath, however, didn't look at the bed or the toys. She ran straight to the window, pressing her small hands against the glass. For the first time, she wasn't looking up at the world through a street-level grate. She was looking down at it from a position of security. "I can see the whole sky," she whispered, her voice thick with wonder. Floriano watched them, a profound sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. He had spent a lifetime acquiring properties and seizing territories, but none of those victories felt as substantial as this. He realized that the luxury of his mansion had been a hollow display until it was used to provide a haven for the innocent. As Elizabeth finally let out a sob, sinking onto the edge of a velvet chair as if the weight of the world had finally been lifted, Floriano simply nodded and stepped back into the hallway. He had given them the sun, and in doing so, he had finally cleared the shadows from his own heart. The following week, the Romani estate was transformed into a glittering arena of power and prestige. It was the night of the annual Winter Gala, an event where the city's elite, both legitimate and otherwise, gathered to pay homage to the man who held their world in his hand. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, aged brandy, and the quiet, underlying tension that always accompanied a gathering of wolves. Floriano stood at the head of the grand staircase, his navy suit impeccably tailored, his presence commanding the room before he had even spoken a word. The hall was filled with men who traded in fear, and women who wore diamonds as armor. They expected a speech about territories, growth, or the strength of the Romani name. Instead, the music faded to a whisper as Floriano signaled for silence. He didn't speak immediately. He reached back toward the shadows of the gallery, and out stepped a small figure that made the room catch its collective breath. Kath was dressed in a gown of soft, midnight blue, her light brown hair styled in elegant curls that caught the light of the chandeliers. She no longer looked like the girl crouching on a kitchen floor, she looked like a princess emerging from a dream. Her hand was tucked firmly into Floriano's palm, her innocent fearful eyes now replaced by a quiet, steady dignity. "Tonight is not about business," Floriano began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that echoed off the marble walls. He looked down at the girl, then back at the assembly of predators. "I have spent my life building walls and securing legacies. But the greatest legacy is not what we take, it is what we choose to protect." He placed a protective hand on Kath's shoulder, a gesture that was as much a blessing as it was a warning. "I would like to introduce you to Kath J. Garber. As of this evening, she is my ward and a member of the Romani household. She carries my name, she resides in my home, and she is under my absolute protection." A ripple of stunned whispers moved through the crowd. In the underworld, such a declaration was more than a formal introduction, it was a decree. By naming her his ward, Floriano was signaling to every rival, every soldier, and every opportunist in the city that Kath was untouchable. To harm her, to threaten her, or to even look at her with ill intent was now synonymous with declaring war on Floriano himself. Elizabeth stood in the shadows of the upper balcony, her eyes shimmering with tears. She was no longer just a maid. She was the mother of the most protected child in the city. She watched as Floriano led Kath down the stairs, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before them. The crime boss didn't care about the confusion on his enemies' faces or the shock of his associates. He only cared about the small hand holding his own. He had spent 30 years being the man everyone feared, tonight, he was the man one child trusted. As they reached the ballroom floor, Floriano realized that the Romani protection wasn't just a shield for Kath, it was the final brick in the fortress he was building for his own soul. The girl who had once eaten scraps was now the jewel of the empire, and the city finally understood that the most dangerous man in the room had found something worth more than power. 10 years had passed since the crinkle of a plastic snack bag had rewritten the fate of the Romani Empire, and today, the mansion was filled with a light that had nothing to do with its golden chandeliers. Floriano stood in the front row of the university's grand auditorium, his navy suit as sharp as ever, though the silver at his temples now reflected a decade of a different kind of labor. He wasn't watching for threats or calculating margins. His eyes were fixed on the stage, where a young woman with light brown hair and a steady, brilliant gaze stood at the podium. Kath J. Garber was no longer the shivering child of the pantry. She stood before the graduating class as their valedictorian, a scholar of medicine whose hands were destined to heal rather than hide. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble with the fear of being heard, it resonated with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged in the sun. As she accepted her honors, she looked directly at Floriano, and the small, knowing smile she offered him was a more powerful tribute than any title he had ever earned. Later that afternoon, they stood together on the same sun-drenched terrace where he had first given her a room with a view. Elizabeth was there, too, her gray look a distant memory, her face radiant with a health and peace that had once seemed impossible. She moved through the gardens not as a shadow, but as the heartbeat of the home, her laughter drifting up on the summer breeze. Floriano leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the city he had once ruled through intimidation. His ledgers were still full, and his name still commanded respect, but the nature of his power had undergone a quiet, total transformation. He had spent 30 years believing that an empire was built on what you took from others, territory, loyalty, and debt. He had thought that business was the art of winning a zero-sum game. But as he looked at Kath, who was discussing her residency plans with a fire in her eyes, Floriano realized that his greatest achievement didn't reside in his bank accounts or his properties. It wasn't a deal struck in a smoke-filled room or a rival silenced in the dark. His masterpiece was the woman standing beside him, a life that would go on to save thousands of others because he had chosen to notice her in the dark. "I'm ready for what's next, Floriano," Kath said, her hand resting briefly on his arm, a touch that was free of the startled fear of her childhood. "I know you are," he replied, his voice a low, proud rumble. In that moment, the ruthless boss of the Romani family understood the ultimate truth of his legacy. He had traded the ledger of blood for a future of promise. He had learned that the most significant business decision a man could make had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with humanity. Saving one life hadn't just changed Kath's world, it had resurrected his own. The monster had long since vanished, replaced by a man who understood that true immortality isn't found in a name feared by the city, but in the dreams of a child you refuse to let disappear. The legacy was reborn, and for the first time in his life, Floriano Romani knew he was truly wealthy.